Two, three. Hello, my friends. It's Bradley J and the Bradley J Show. And then I'm suddenly animated here. I've been dragging ass all morning long. But when I see Rich Rubino, I get excited. And we're going to talk about this. It used to be that the Soviet Union was the evil empire, and Republican Ronald Reagan made it his business to bring down the evil empire. And now a significant faction of the Republican Party is embracing the evil empire. What's going on? And that's what Rich is here to talk about. So, 1, 2, 3, go, Rich.
Well, completely different circumstance in terms of the Cold War, Soviet Union, basically going from the time of, you can go all the way from basically from Truman through George H.W. Bush. There was basically a Cold War consensus. Yes.
I have to interrupt.
Yeah.
You say a completely different scenario. It seems to me that Putin, well, it's pretty obvious that Putin is trying to regenerate the original scenario, and that's what we would try to prevent. He was around in the Soviet Union. He said the Soviet Union, the crash of the Soviet Union was the biggest problem of the biggest disaster of the 20th century, and now he's trying to recreate that. It's his thing, and so why wouldn't it be pretty much the same, trying to either prevent a Soviet Union from forming again?
I think because during that time of the Cold War consensus, it was basically binary. It was essentially between communism and capitalism. And obviously, the Soviet Union wasn't completely communist, and the United States was not completely capitalist. Like every economy, they were essentially mixed economy, but it's where you lean. And essentially, that was the argument. That was why the United States was involved in a proxy war with the Soviet Union in Korea. That was essentially Vietnam, was essentially the whole argument over communism. But that was why there were so many coups in Central America, for example. In the United States, I think in many respects used communism. Basically, they would say to a lot of countries, no matter how they treat their own people, no matter what their human rights record is, it comes down to realpolitik, meaning essentially that we will form alliances with any nation as long as they are not communist.
Well,
So
there is the alliance with Iran. There's a sort of alliance with China. The players may be different, but there are factions forming and gluing together that are would love to bring the United States down. So,
well, Iran's an interesting case because the whole thing with Iran, basically, Mohammad Mossadegh was a democratically elected prime minister of Iran. And Winston Churchill was prime minister of Great Britain, and Mossadegh decided he was going to nationalize the oil fields in Iran. So he did that. Churchill did not like that. Churchill wanted the cheap oil. So he went to the Truman administration, the last year of the administration, and said, what do you think of the idea of us sponsoring a coup to essentially dislodge him from power? Truman said no. Then he went to Eisenhower in 1953, and Eisenhower reluctantly essentially agreed. So the United States and Great Britain essentially sponsored a coup, which took out a democratically elected leadership in Iran and installed the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran comes in 1953 and essentially impresses his own people. He had avowed his secret police. And basically that is essentially why in 1979 there was the hostage crisis, and there was essentially a coup. The Shah had to essentially leave. He went into exile, and essentially when the Ayatollah Khomeini came in, the Shah was having cancer treatments. He wanted to come to the clinic in the United States. Jimmy Carter reluctantly accepted it on part of the advice of Presidents Ford, Nixon, and Kissinger. And when the Shah came in, the Iranian people, many of them started to think that the reason he was coming to the United States is the United States was going to sponsor another coup, and they were going to try to bring the Shah back into power. So consequently, you had the hostage crisis, which apparently destroyed the foreign policy of Jimmy Carter, at least for the second 2 years, and held the country hostage.
I get all that, and it's certainly legitimate. But in the big picture, forces were amassed against the United States, and again, they are. Why would these little details justify this faction and the GOP to embrace the enemy?
Well, I think that, okay, so back to 1991. Essentially, when the Cold War ended, the story is George H.W. Bush sends James Baker over to what was essentially now the former Soviet Union, met with Gorbachev, and basically said there'll be no more expansion of NATO. We keep NATO the way it is, but we would not expand it. So the Russians, essentially, their fear when we continue to expand NATO, it would be the equivalent of, for example, the Russians, if they had during the time of the Warsaw Pact, if they had bases on Canada and Mexico, or for that matter, Cuba, you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, that they could essentially spy on us. So they saw the idea of NATO as essentially kind of a slap in the face, and they were trepidatious toward it. So then a few years later, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary come in. Then a few other countries come in, and there was just this proliferation. And I think that was what kind of began this process of many in the old Soviet Union, now Russia, who came to believe that perhaps the United States was trying to essentially take away all these satellite republics, all these former Soviet satellite republics. And Vladimir Putin basically kind of said enough in terms of saying that we're going to kind of draw the line at on Ukraine, because Ukraine, we know that they want to join NATO. Now, will they ever get into NATO? Probably not. But he essentially said, okay, we're going to draw the line. This started this whole war, and it actually backfired on him because the world public opinion is really turned against him. And countries like Norway and Sweden, who were, I think, who really who didn't very much have a chance of getting into NATO, now getting an application, a speeding up application, and get right into NATO. So it backfired in that respect. But I think there's a difference between the foreign policy, the way we viewed the Soviet Union under communist power, under Brezhnev and under Khrushchev, and certainly than the way we view it under first Boris Yeltsin and then under Vladimir Putin. Now, in the Republican Party, at the Cold War, there was this chasm when the Cold War ended. There are folks like Bill Kristol who had the Weekly Standard, interventionists, who Dick Cheney was one of them, Paul Wolfowitz, called the neoconservatives.
Mm-hmm.
The neoconservatives, many of them were former Democrats, who essentially were refugees who became Republicans after McGovern garnered the nomination in 1972. Some of them supported Scoop Jackson in 72, 76, a Washington state senator. Someone like Richard Pearl actually worked for him. And then they said essentially, now at the end of the Cold War, we're a unipolar world, and we should essentially be hegemonic over everybody else, and we should be trying to bring democracy, basically export it, sometimes with the barrel of a gun, all over the world. And then on the other side were the non-interventionists, many of them former hawks like Pat Buchanan, who now said it's time to, as George McGovern said, come home, America. So these were the two sides. He said, now it's time. We had to increase the military budget during the Cold War. Now we have to gradually truncate the military budget. He says, we need to come home. We need to bring the troops home. We just essentially, in his case, he would say, we need to give NATO notice that we're going to essentially leave NATO. Some would even say we need to leave the United Nations, we need to leave the WTO, all these other organizations. So that was really, I think, that was really the crux of what happened at the end of the Cold War. Now, when Iraq happened, when the United States invaded Iraq, George W. Bush, who had popularity in the stratosphere, 90% after 9/11, he goes to the Republican Party, and he basically says, I want congressional authorization first to go into Afghanistan. Every solitary Republican in the House and the Senate voted for that. Only Barbara Lee from California is now running for an open Senate seat, voted against it. In the Senate, it was unanimous. In terms of going into Iraq, in their Senate, only Lincoln Chafee, the liberal Republican, voted against it. In the Senate side and the House side, only a few kind of recalcitrant non-interventionists like John Duncan from Tennessee and Ron Paul from Texas voted against it. But the point is, Bush made it essentially unified, that in terms of going into Iraq, that we are now the Republican Party is the interventionist party. So what happened? Iraq became a very unpopular war. We did not find any weapons of mass destruction. There was no link allocating Al Qaeda to Saddam Hussein. In fact, Saddam Hussein was an arch adversary of Al Qaeda. So the Iraq War becomes extremely unpopular. 2006, George W. Bush suffers a shellacking at the polls. It's in the House of Representatives, first time since 1994 that the Democrats took over the House of Representatives again, in part because Iraq was so unpopular. John McCain, 2008, garners the nomination. And interestingly, though, here's what's fascinating. In 2008, there was a debate, and Ron Paul was congressman from Texas, kind of quasi-libertarians running, and Rudy Giuliani are on the stage. And they ask about 9/11, and Ron Paul says essentially they're over here because we were over there. Now, what did he mean by that? He essentially said that we were attacked because of our foreign policy. He pointed to, for example, the fatwa that Osama bin Laden offered, fatwa being essentially an Islamic holy statement. And in that statement, he says his main grievance was the fact that the United States, during the Gulf War and then after, put mostly Christian troops on Saudi soil, and essentially Muhammad's one of his last wishes there should never be secular forces that would be on will be in the land of Mecca and Medina, which is of course Saudi Arabia. So basically, Osama bin Laden himself, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, offered, and again, this is fascinating, offered the Saudi royal family about 100,000 Arab Afghan Mujahideen troops, his troops, because they haven't really fought a major battle since Afghanistan. He wanted them to get in practice to defend Saudi Arabia from Iraq. George H.W. Bush did not like that idea, so he sent Colin Powell and James Baker basically to go over there, and they made an agreement the United States instead would essentially defend Saudi Arabia, the Saudi kingdom, from Saddam Hussein's aggression. That began this whole thing. That was his basic fatwa. Then he had other things in there, for example, our support for autocratic regimes, the human effects of the economic sanctions on Iraq during the 1990s, kind of an underreported story, but they really had many effects, particularly on poor children. And then he brought up other issues. He brought up the Middle East. He brought up support for Israel. There are all these issues. That's basically what he was saying. He's talking about the plight of the Palestinians. So Ron Paul brings that up and basically says, we're over there because they're over here because we're over there. And then Rudy Giuliani looks at him and he says, that sounds like those liberal professors I hear all the time. I hope you didn't mean that. And the next day, the chair of the Missionary Republican Party is saying Ron Paul should essentially be exited, should never be allowed in another debate. People are saying he should be expelled from the party. Now, fast forward to 2022, because of Donald Trump, because of Donald Trump's presidential candidacy, being against the war in Afghanistan, being against the war in Iraq, at least when he ran for president anyways.
And being very pro-Russian, at least in his rhetoric.
Ron Paul's views are now more mainstream. Ron Paul is basically the same in terms of Donald Trump, except that Ron Paul obviously was against tariffs, but the Pat Buchanan ran for president in 1992, 1996. In 1996, he actually won the New Hampshire primary by a point. His views in the Republican Party are now essentially partly the insurgent wing of the Republican Party. On the other side, you have the establishment wing, many people who go back to the Bush years. That's why you have folks like Mitch McConnell, reluctantly Kevin McCarthy, and some Republicans running for president who aren't doing too well in the polls right now, like for example, Mike Pence and Nikki Haley, who are very much Chris Christie as well, who are very much taking the old kind of pre-Trump interventionist foreign policy when it comes to Russia.
Okay, you could try to apply all those details, or you could just say that this faction of the GOP it's a way to be anti-Biden. They're just going to be contra anything Biden does. And back to the situation now, I take a big picture look at it and say the United States was perceived as weak because they were, and under the Trump administration, it's pretty clear that Trump would have given away Ukraine if he could have, and and so it seemed like it was going to be easy. And the other thing is Putin's legacy. He just was crushed by the fall of the Soviet Union and wants to see it built back by the time he dies. And other countries like China are completely watching to see what happens. They want to see this be the end of the Roman Empire, this be the end of the United States and their power, and they're wondering, is this the time? And this is where you push back. If you don't, it's over.
Well,
back to these. They will say that the United States was being aggressive. It just wasn't going to happen. Ukraine was not ever going to be in NATO, and neither was it Sweden and Norway with their substantial military. So I don't buy this idea that Putin is justified in feeling like he was being encroached upon. To me, that's a rhetorical tool used by this group.
Yeah, I'm just trying to essentially elucidate what Putin's essential argument is. And during NATO expansion, there were many Republicans and Democrats like Bill Bradley. This was 1997 when they brought Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary in, who were saying at the time, essentially, don't do this. Gary Hart, the former senator from Colorado, was another one who essentially said, don't do this. This is going to effectuate a new Cold War tension between the United States. And obviously, by the way, in terms of This certainly worked out for countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, because now they are obviously members of NATO and they get protection. And obviously that is something that certainly is advantageous toward them.
Yeah, and Poland's now super heavily armed.
Yep.
So one of the complaints of the GOP is that we have to spend money doing this. But when you have, and we're selling a lot of equipment to other countries, it's not a total loss. This is a business, and it's a big business, and the United States wins in this business. To me, it just smacks of a political device to be against the mainstream Republicans and Biden.
Well, I want to say this, though, about the idea that they're just anti-Biden. You got to remember that when the Tea Party movement began, essentially, a lot of it was over the Affordable Care Act. They were opposed to it around 2010. These conservatives are a different breed than the establishment conservatives you hear with Mitch McConnell, for example. These conservatives, in terms of domestic policy, in many respects, they're very libertarian. They're not necessarily social conservatives. Some of them might even be kind of some way socially agnostic. But when it comes to foreign policy, and they were making the case in the same way when Barack Obama, for example, supported the invasion of Libya. Some of them were against the idea of going into Iraq and Afghanistan. They're basically, and I don't use the term isolationist because that's really a misnomer. Isolationists would say essentially the United States should have no trade policy with any country, and almost nobody believes that. But there is a term called non-interventionist. And they were essentially non-interventionist and basically would say from 2010, during the last years of the Obama administration, that the United States needs to spend their money at home. Some of them, for example, were somewhat economic nationalists. They were very much afraid of the multinational corporations taking over. And Donald Trump really saw an opening in the Republican Party. There was an aperture right there, the size of the Grand Canyon. Pretty much most Republican candidates, at least major Republican presidential candidates, were interventionists overseas. They talked about a muscular foreign policy. They were basically Bushites. They were basically Cheneyites. Ron Paul's son, the senator from Kentucky, was in the race, and he was seen as somewhat of a fringe candidate. He couldn't really get over 3 or 4%. But Donald Trump comes in part with his charisma, and makes the argument. And he makes the argument in one of the debates with Jeb Bush. When Jeb Bush is talking, Donald Trump looks at him and he essentially says, well, the World Trade Center fell into your brother's watch. That's not keeping us safe. And they talked about what a disaster Iraq was. He talks about disaster Afghanistan was. He made it okay to be in the Republican Party and not be an interventionist, to not be a neoconservative, to the point that contemporaneously, neoconservative, at least I'm not talking about members of Congress, members of the House, members of the Senate, but within grassroots conservative movement, neoconservative is now subservient to either the libertarian wing or to the populist wing in the Republican Party. And you see a rise, at least in the Democratic Party now, of interventionists. There are some folks in the Democratic Party who have now become the interventionists when it comes to the Soviet Union. And this reminds me so much of what happened in the Democratic Party in the 1970s. There was so in 1970, right after Lyndon Johnson, there was between Truman and Johnson, Truman, Kennedy, Johnson, Stevenson in between them, were all basically interventionists, Cold War interventionists on foreign policy. So in 1972, George McGovern was a 200-to-1 long shot at the beginning, anti-Vietnam War candidate, most liberal candidate in the race, senator from South Dakota, garners the Democratic presidential nomination. He changes the trajectory of the Democratic Party. Now you have another senator in that race who was very much a Cold War liberal named Henry Scoop Jackson from Washington State. And as a result, many of Scoop Jackson's former supporters became Republicans and became neoconservatives because they saw the Democratic Party of Kennedy and Johnson and Truman and Stevenson of essentially leaving them. Now, Scoop Jackson runs again for president in 1976. Scoop Jackson runs again as kind of a Cold War liberal. He never abjured his support for the United States going into the Vietnam War. And in 1976, he runs again. Now, his views are now in 72 and 76 are now minority opinion in the Democratic Party. He's the status quo ante. That means he's a status quo prior to the status quo. That is now where I think folks like Nikki Haley are on Russia. They are now the status quo ante, and obviously there are a multiplicity of voices. It's a cacophony of voices, if you will. It's almost polyphonic, if you will, within the Republican Party. And on the Democratic side, the same thing is going on because there were many of the members of while you have the Freedom Caucus, the most conservative members of the House of Representatives, on the liberal side of the Democratic Party, folks like Barbara Lee and AOC, they are also very much for less intervention overseas. Ralph Nader's bicycle rams right into Pat Buchanan's Mercedes right now, and you have a right-left coalition against intervention and a center-left, center-right coalition very much supporting the establishment contemporaneous interventions.
Are we intervening, or are we supporting an ally?
I think my definition of intervention is essentially getting involved, whether it's, I don't mean necessarily military, and certainly I'm not saying they were sending in ground troops, but when you're selling equipment, you're essentially, when you're selling equipment, if you're giving away equipment, no matter what you're doing, if you're arming somebody, then I say yes. If you're lifting an arms embargo, anything like that, I would say yes, that is essentially intervention. Even you can even argue just picking a side. If two countries are at war, you pick one side, and then theoretically you're intervening.
Are they under the, do you subscribe to the notion that Putin would just stop at Ukraine, or that he would try to get, the people in Latvia are scared to death.
Yeah, Moldova.
All the time.
Yes.
Of getting reinvaded. Do you not feel that would happen? Do you think Ukraine's just a one and done thing?
That's the $64,000 question. I don't know what his ultimate objective is. You would think, I think it's certainly changed since the invasion of the Ukraine. Now, I think he just wants to save face.
Right.
Somebody who wants a legacy beyond what he thinks of his country. He wants a personal legacy. You have to always bring politics down to the personal, not necessarily to the patriotic.
Right.
What his actual objective is now, and what his objective was before, I don't know. Does he want to reconstitute the entire former Soviet Union? Bring the whole band back together? My guess is he knows that that's probably not going to happen, and certainly he knows that he will not be able to bring in any of the countries that are currently in NATO, any of the former Soviet satellite states. But I don't know what his objective is. And you're going to hear this all the time, so I'll bring it up. But you hear this all the time when Chamberlain made a deal in Munich in 1938, and essentially he said, "Okay, well, we'll bring back a certain amount of land, and essentially that's going to be it." But then Hitler didn't really live up to the agreement. He kept moving in, and that's kind of, so there are two views in history.
Right.
There's the World War II view, which is essentially that the United States needs to view every possible foreign aggression like it's World War II. The other side is Vietnam, and that's the view that essentially that the United States saw the war in Vietnam as essentially a way to expand the Leninist, Stalinist view, Marxist view of communism. You have to stop it right there, as opposed to it being simply a civil war between North and South Vietnam.
Right. So I suppose some could, there was the domino theory over Vietnam, and there's a sort of a mini potential domino theory with Russia now. I'm a complete hypocrite because I support the defense of Ukraine, but I wonder, maybe it's not worth intervening in China and Taiwan, because I just don't want to be at war all the time. And I go so far as to say maybe we can make a deal with China. I would just say, what about making a deal with China to fight Russia if we say, you know what, go ahead and take Taiwan.
That's very Nixonian of you.
Well,
trying to put the Sino-Soviet divide, and he actually very much worked with them when he went to China.
They seem like they're pretty practical, and it seems like at least for 10 years we could make them an ally and just take Russia out of the picture.
I can't see, I'm trying to imagine if China were to actually go and invade Taiwan, and imagine if the United States actually said, okay, we're going to send ground troops to defend Taiwan. Imagine the upheaval in this country. Imagine what would happen in this country, because I think most Americans could not find Taiwan on a map, frankly. And this is something that they never, it's a conflict that's kind of, it's an intellectual conflict. Most people aren't necessarily thinking of it. But that would be, you think Vietnam divided this country. That would, I don't even know who divided this country, because I don't think there would be that much of it. I don't see who the advocates, that there would be a major advocates for the United States supporting Taiwan in a war between China and Taiwan.
Right.
That being said, would China actually do it? And what would they actually do it? Would they think they can get away with it because of the upheaval in other places? I don't know.
Well, pre-Ukraine, I think if Ukraine hadn't happened, they definitely would have. Now they still might. But again, is there anything about Taiwan that is important to the U.S.? I know they're a chip maker, right? But we can make chips. I mean, let's ramp up the chip making. I think we should get something for Taiwan while we can before China just takes it. Here's a deal. Go ahead. It'll be so much cheaper for you to do our deal. Help us actually send China. You send weapons to Ukraine and take out Russia.
Taiwan.
You can just have Taiwan. We got to get something for Taiwan while we can. There's something inherently different about an invasion of Ukraine. To me, the hypocrite that I am, an invasion of Taiwan.
That this is actually a relic of the Cold War. If you go back when essentially Mao Zedong came in, they took out Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of Taiwan, and the Taiwanese leadership, in many respects, the former Chinese government, some of them fled to Taiwan when it was called for Formosa, and there were some like Jesse Helms, the senator from North Carolina, for example, that said that we should always recognize Taiwan as the real China. It was actually Jimmy Carter in '79 who restored relations between the United States and China, and basically said that mainland China, that's China, not this little island of Taiwan. But there's some hawks that said that we should never recognize a communist country like China. So this is all historic. And in 1952, when Harry Truman was the most unpopular president in American history, at least in the history of polling, 22% job approval rating. He couldn't even run for re-election because he lost the New Hampshire primary to Estes Kefauver. And that year, the Republican Party was not running so much against Stevenson, the Democratic nominee, as they were running against Truman, who was so unpopular, and they ran against Korea, communism, and corruption. Korea was a stalemate. The Korean War, Truman could not win. There was corruption within the lower levels of the Truman administration, and they blamed Harry Truman for losing China because China went communist and the Chinese government flees to Taiwan. We're still in many respects in that mindset because we're still, even though we're not in necessarily a Cold War against communism, there is very much an anti-communist ethos in the United States. When we see communism, we immediately think of, the Gulag Archipelago or Solzhenitsyn. We think of 16-hour work labor camps, and the United States is very vociferous against communism.
There are a couple of YouTubers that cover the conflict in Ukraine that I want to put up on the screen here. I love them. One's a guy in Ukraine, Denis Davidoff, Davidoff, Denis Davidoff, and another guy named Jake Bro. I love them. There are others, but these two folks, I recommend them. One guy is more, Denis Davidoff is more about the war map, etc. Jake Bro is more of a big picture guy and talks about the finances involved and how the price of oil affects the whole war effort and stuff. For anybody who watches this, I recommend those. You may like them, you may not, but at least check them out. All right.
There we go. I'm getting propaganda here from the Russian Ministry of Information, I think.
That's where are you getting that?
No, I'm getting
a text. What is that? There's
a printer.
fax?
It's a printer, and every once in a while, you'll get almost the equivalent of telemarketing.
Really? Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, so anything else that I haven't considered in this whole thing as we try to figure out how the pro-Russian faction in the GOP, how you justify what they're doing? Okay, I understand, and I know there's a faction on the left the same way, just non-interventionist. I tend to feel that it's just being counter status quo, but okay.
But I think they are people who really believe this, and it's not only Russia, by the way. Matt Gaetz, for example, from Florida, he wants to take. So we have 900 members of the special forces currently in Syria, basically fighting ISIS. And Matt Gaetz had a resolution which had bipartisan support to essentially that we needed an accounting, potentially bring the troops home, saying how are these 900 troops essentially going to defend us against this caliphate, this Muslim empire, if you will. So it's not just Russia. There is a non-interventionist strand in essentially both parties, and part of it is the idea of bringing troops home. And also, by the way, if you look at the United States military budget versus every other country's military budget, we're almost $1 trillion. Other countries are like 200. And the other argument is, why aren't these other countries spending more on their military budget? Why are we spending so much specifically on the military budget? And that whenever you heard the military-industrial complex, that used to be rhetoric of the left. Now it's also rhetoric on the right. Donald Trump actually uses that. But imagine if somebody said that in 2004 when George W. Bush was running the Republican Party. Then immediately be seen that person's an apostate. That person's not really a Republican. That person's a Noam Chomskyite. Now, essentially, there is a consensus on the right and the left against these interventions. And in many respects, it's some of the newer Congress people who haven't been, it's some of the newer members on both the right and the left that are very much non-interventionist. But you hear the argument you hear on the right is essentially we need to spend this money protecting our borders, protecting us from fentanyl, and sometimes they'll say we need to protect us from China. And the argument essentially you hear on the left is essentially, why are we spending so much money overseas? Very similar, when this is money that we could be spending for healthcare and for other domestic priorities. So that reminds me of George McGovern's candidacy, 1972. You have, and then Pat Buchanan's candidacy in 92 and 90 and 96. And I'll try to simplify it this way. In the conservative movement, there are basically two major bloodlines. There are others, but there are two major bloodlines. There is conservative interventionism. That's what most of the establishment, John Thune, Mitch McConnell, most of the establishment of the Republican Party are essentially conservative interventionists. Then they're conservative non-interventionists. That's essentially Matt Gaetz. That's Donald Trump. So that's the war over on this side. On the Democratic side, you have folks on the center left who are very much saying that this is justified. It's justified that we help Ukraine, and we need to have a muscular foreign policy. This is almost the rejiggering or the recalibration, if you will, the reconstitution, if you will, of the old Scoop Jackson hawkish wing of the Democratic Party. Then there are liberal. I'll make another wing here. There are also, I think, liberal altruists. I would call them liberal altruists, are those who would say we need to intervene in foreign policy. We need to do it from a humanitarian standpoint. For example, when the United States intervened in Somalia, that was mainly humanitarian. When they intervened in Bosnia, Kosovo, many of the liberal altruists supported that. Then there are liberal non-interventionists, and they are those who essentially say we have domestic priorities at home, and if we get involved in foreign affairs, this is where the right and the left meet again, then essentially what we're doing is we're antagonizing the world, and we're potentially putting the United States into a future war. And interestingly, the center left also makes that argument. I've heard the center left making that argument, saying we need to essentially continue to support NATO so we can prevent a war. Right. Folks on the left are saying we need to essentially, instead of defending NATO, and instead of supporting NATO, we need to essentially get out. We need to essentially get out, and we need to take care of ourselves. And if we do that, then we're kind of almost like a neutral party. So it's a very nuanced, but foreign policy is always obviously a very nuanced avenue.
I know it's tricky business, but history shows us that as soon as the big boy on the block is shown to be weak, like Rome is shown to be weak, people will come to get them. That's what history shows us. Let me ask you this: if President Biden were non-interventionist, would Matt Gaetz be attaboy, Joe? I agree with you 100%.
Yeah, I think he would. I think he would actually, and this is why.
Fair enough.
The Tea Party wing goes way before Donald Trump. They've always had that essential on foreign policy. And these are this is partly how they came to Congress. They always had this argument saying essentially we need to stop intervening in the world. We need to take care of our borders. I'll say instead of protecting, for example, instead of protecting the DMZ in between the North and South Korea, someone would say we need to protect our own borders. We need to put our troops on our own borders. So that's very much a conservative, non-interventionist point of view. And there are some times, by the way, when, for example, President Obama would agree with the Tea Party on certain issues, for example, getting tough on China, that type of thing. But I do think in the case of Matt Gaetz that he would basically be saying that. Plus, In Matt Gaetz's case, he knows that he's not being elected himself. He's got a safe district, but also in terms of his own political standing, it's domestic issues which are the flagship issue for him. Foreign policy, and this is true for most politicians, is really an afterthought unless the United States has ground troops in a physical war. Other than that, he can essentially say, yes, I co-opt what Joe Biden says on foreign policy. Joe Biden's right there. But you know what? Joe Biden is a traitor to our country, and then he can talk about stuff. He can talk about
Right.
domestically, and he can talk about Hunter's laptop and everything else. So, yeah, I do think he would be saying the same thing.
So Will Lyons asked a pretty good question. Which way, when it comes to intervention, does Ron DeSantis lean?
Yes, fascinating, because Ron DeSantis, when he was in the United States Congress, before he was governor, he was a congressman, and he actually thought about running for Senate. He was a Senate candidate. This is when Marco Rubio ran for president in 2016. Then Marco Rubio drops out of the presidential race, decides he wants to keep his Senate seat, and DeSantis gets out. When he was a congressman and senator, he was very much intervention. He was very tough on Russia, whether on the Crimea, on the Ukraine, on Georgia, for example. But Tucker Carlson, who's the kind of the tribune of non-interventionist conservatism, wrote essentially a correspondence to some of the Republican candidates asking their views on the Ukraine. And DeSantis surprised a lot of people here because he took a position that was basically close to what Donald Trump took. And he says essentially that this is not our strategic interest to be bogged down in the Ukraine when we have other issues like our border, like China. This is alienating him from folks like Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio, very much a interventionist in terms of foreign policy. Folks like Mike McCall, the Democrats from Texas, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the House of Representatives. This is dividing him from many members of the establishment of the Republican Party. And it's interesting because he's going to have to justify how he's different now than he was in the early, 2013, 2014, 2015, when he was very much took a very much different position. Now, obviously, when you're governor of Florida, the only real foreign policy position you have is that you're against communism. You don't like what's going on in Venezuela and Cuba. But when you're running nationally, you have to take a position. And he so far has tried to attenuate himself he's tried to allocate himself to the Trump wing, not to the Nikki Haley, Mitch McConnell wing.
All right. More about DeSantis. The more I see of DeSantis, the more I think he's so bereft of any sort of charisma that Trump will crush
well
him.
Of you.
What's that?
Speaks well of you.
Thank you. We talked about that. I'm sorry I cannot spek as well of, and I appreciate that
that he does.
Governor DeSantis speaks well of me,
Yeah.
and I don't want to make him regret that. However, he's bereft of any sort of charisma, and the more I see of him, he's on empty. His jaw flaps, but is not charismatic. He's just saying it in this empty, husky way, and I can see why he doesn't come clean about running, because that becomes more evident the more you see him. He does these goofy.
He's very
He's goofy, man.
He's
There you go.
Nixonian.
He's what?
Nixon was the last candidate I can think of who the last person who was elected president who really did not seem to have a comportment with people, did not seem to really like people. He would try to sit on the window seat of airplanes because he did not want people coming up asking him for autographs, for example.
Right.
But he went through the process and became president. And there's an eerie similitude between, I think, Nixon and DeSantis in that respect. I do think it's interesting. First of all, I think the reason he's not announcing, and it actually makes a lot of sense to me, is because he's in a legislative session. And when you're in a legislative session, it's better to say, it's a Rose Garden strategy. Essentially, you say, well, right now I have a job to do, even though he's out promoting books, which is an inherent contradiction. But he says, I have a job to do. I'm governor of Florida, so I'm not thinking about that right now. Then in May, when the legislative session ends, he can start running for president. The same thing Bill Clinton did in 91, the same thing George W. Bush did in 1999 when they were governors. They both waited for the legislation session to end to announce their candidacy. So that's what I think he's doing. I think that it's interesting. I think when you hear this argument, this is what I thought he would make. He's going to say that I was elected governor of Florida by less than 2,000 votes, one of the closest elections in American history. Then I was reelected with almost 19 points. So he's going to say, the people in Florida have approved of what I've been doing. Now, by the way, that was the largest win of any governor since Bob Graham, a Democrat in '82, and the largest of any Republican since Jeb Bush in 2002. Part of that is not because of him. Part of that is because the the state of Florida, in part because of the influx of people moving in, partly because of Miami-Dade County is becoming more conservative. The state is just becoming no longer a swing state. It's becoming more of a Republican state. Marco Rubio running for Senate basically won by the same percentage as Ron DeSantis. But that being said, he can certainly flaunt the fact that he can brandish the fact that he won by that many points. And that's basically going to be his argument: is the people were skeptical of me at the beginning. Now the people of Florida essentially like me. And George W. Bush made that same argument.
Right. And another thing about DeSantis, I noticed he's completely decided I'm putting all my eggs in the anti-woke basket. And I kind of get that, because that cultural thing really, really resonates with the conservatives. But I see it so much that it almost looks crutchy. It's like a crutch, like that's all you got. Are you seeing that? Are you seeing that? Like it might kind of wear thin?
It's something that will benefit him with a certain segment in the Republican Party. If he does garner the nomination, I don't think that's an issue that's going to win him the presidency. I don't think the whole woke issue and the whole issue of the whole issue just generally about whether it's the transgender issue or whether he bans books, he doesn't ban books, all this stuff, there's stuff. This is not going to be what the election is going to be decided. The election is going to be decided on, is the country at war at the time? What is inflation like? Essentially, what is the economy at the time? And partly, if Joe Biden is the nominee, which he probably will be, it's going to be whether Joe Biden has the mental capacity to be president, because rightly or wrongly, the Republicans are going to make the case, and they're going to try to do it somewhat inadvertently, but they're going to try to make the case that he's too old because he's 82 years old. So that's going to be what's really going to be on the economy more than anything else. These other issues are something that galvanizes a certain base within conservatism. He knows that. The Ukraine is another one that he knows where the Republican Party is going. He's very much like a weather vane in that respect. He knows which side to get on right now. But obviously, if he does win the primary, then he gets to pivot. And this is where his reelection comes in. So it comes in because then he can say, well, this is what he can say to the voters in the general election. He can say, you know what? People were skeptical of me in my home state of Florida, and I barely won the first time around. But then look what happened. The second time around, I run against the former governor. He'll say the guy who had a 70% job approval when he was governor. I run against Charlie Crist, a guy who was very formidable. And look what happens. I win by almost 19%. So essentially, try me. And so he'll very much try to move to the center in the general election. I think if he does win the nomination, you'll hear very little about the woke except for behind closed doors if he's at a fundraiser in Amarillo, Texas or something.
So who's going to be the nominee?
Oh, gosh, I don't know.
Yes, you do. You have an opinion. I know you stay away from...
On the Democratic side...
No, the conservative side.
On the Democratic side, my supposition is Joe Biden beats Marianne Williamson. I really think he's going to have a victory. I really think Marianne Williamson might get to 10% in some states, but I really think Joe Biden would beat her. Now,
so you're going out on a limb for that one. Thank you for that.
Yes, I really think, I'm sure Marianne Williamson will try to challenge him to some Lincoln Douglas-style debates, but my guess is Joe Biden's going to win this thing. And you know what? If I was betting an encore right now, I would bet Joe Biden defeats Marianne Williamson.
All right. So one thing about that Joe Biden has going for him is people keep underestimating him. And now, what about on the right? Who's going to be the nominee? I mean, you can change it. Say you can do this. Say this week, I'm saying, and you can change it next week.
Yes, I'll do that. I'll just say one more thing about Joe Biden, though, about being underestimated. The legislation he's been able to get passed, he did with essentially a tie in the United States Senate and a very slim majority in the House of Representatives. And whether it was the thing that he was able to get passed was really kind of phenomenal. The way, and partly this is because of Nancy Pelosi's dexterity. But, when Lyndon Johnson and Franklin Roosevelt were getting legislation passed in the 60s and 30s, respectively, they had overwhelming majorities in the House of Representatives and the United States Senate. Joe Biden was able to do this with barely a majority whatsoever. So he is very much underestimated. How much of that is him? How much of that is Pelosi? How much of that is Schumer? My guess is an amalgamation. On the Republican side now, if it were right now, I would say Donald Trump. And the reason is because I think there's going to be a litany of people that are going to get in the race. With some people, obviously there's going to be people we're not even thinking about. They're going to potentially pop up a little bit. I think DeSantis is actually going to dissipate a little bit once people. It's going to be like when Tim Pawlenty ran for governor of Minnesota, John Connally, governor of Texas, Rick Perry, governor of Texas. They did very well, and people in the media very much put them on a pedestal. But in many respects, they kind of moved down the list. I think that's probably going to happen to DeSantis, and I think that Donald Trump is going to win. but he's going to do it without winning 50% in just about any state. He'll win 40% here, just like he did last time. He didn't win 50% till his home state of New York. He'll win 39%, 37%. Every other Republican is going to be battling for the rest of it. And I would say that he'll probably will win the nomination right now. But I also think, in everyone who's trying to make this into a binary race, Trump versus DeSantis, there are going to be a lot of other candidates right now. And I really think that DeSantis is not going to, I think he's probably reached his high watermark. He could get back up there, but I really think there's going to be a time where you're going to see him go down to the polls, go down to about 12 or 13%. Maybe like Bill Clinton in 92, after Jennifer Flowers went down to about 12 or 13%, then moves himself, campaigns vigorously in New Hampshire, loses New Hampshire by only 9 points to Saugus, calls himself the comeback kid, and then does come back. But I think there's going to see DeSantis. He's going to be tied with Trump for a while. Then he's going to gradually come down. Then maybe he'll come up again. But that really shows what kind of political dexterity, I guess, that he has. But you're right, he does have a Nixon problem in terms of his personality, can be off-putting. And I think in the case of John Kerry and Mitt Romney, you saw the very similar scenario, and they both ended up losing the general election.
Yeah, exactly. So, question about candidate Trump, and that is would an indictment be a net win? And let me finish before you get into it. A net gain for Trump or a net loss? Would an indictment be good for him or bad for him?
I think,
and on the one hand, he fires up his base like they're out to get him. We're activated. But on the other hand, it's more baggage, and there are a certain number of people say it's just going to be difficult for him to do the job and get what we want done with all this stuff hanging around his neck.
Yeah, it is definitely deleterious. It definitely will have negative effects if he's indicted. Absolutely. Even in the Republican primary, because there are voters right now that like Donald Trump, that thought he did a good job as president, but are looking about electability. And they're saying, do we really want this baggage? They're saying, why don't we get somebody who does not have this kind of overcover, if you will, who does not have this, this penumbra moving with them everywhere. There's these shadows of all these scandals. And just the fact that they'll say strategic voting, and there's a lot of strategic voting out there, tactical voting. They might say, even I like Trump, I might like Donald Trump better, and I even think he'd be a better president, but I don't think he can win. And those voters that's the biggest fear, I think, for Donald Trump, and any sort of indictment will present that. And every time, I'm sure there are a lot of voters would say, I really liked him, but I didn't like what happened at Mar-a-Lago with their raid. Obviously, there's stuff going on. And my biggest fear is Joe Biden does not become president. So I'll hold my nose and I'll vote for somebody else. In the general election, I think Donald Trump is probably the candidate that Joe Biden wants to face more than any other candidate, because he can say, essentially, look at all this stuff over Donald Trump. Do you really want somebody who, at least in Joe Biden's case, will say somebody who will not concede the election? He'll say somebody who led an insurrection against his own country. He'll show, he can, he'll say Joe Biden will say, and he's not going to say this directly, but essentially the candidacy is going to be a referendum on a former incumbent, not necessarily a referendum on the current incumbent. It's not even going to be the referendum on the former incumbent's administration. It's going to be the referendum on, do you really want all this other stuff, all that jazz that came with Donald Trump? So I think he wants to run against Donald Trump more than just about anybody else right now.
Okay. Economy, strangely, is super important when it comes to presidential elections, even though the president doesn't do that much directly for the economy. But right now, the economy seems to be trending fairly well. Gas prices are, I saw $3.39, I think, for it was pretty cheap. And unemployment is low. Yes, there's inflation, but that is being mitigated at this time. It's not all that bad. It's for economy-wise, it seems to me, but you're more of an expert.
Yeah.
Do you think the economy is Biden's friend or Biden's foe?
It was his foe, right? It is his foe today, but I think my guess on the projections, it'll be his friend by election day. And here's why. And you can look at the Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton here. Ronald Reagan lost 26 seats in the House of Representatives in 1982. Part of that was because Paul Volcker was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he used a tight money policy, which helped to effectuate a recession. And Ronald Reagan cut taxes his first year in office. The deficit blew up. The second year, he signed the Tax Equity Act, which cut taxes. But the economy started to improve, and by 1984, he wins 49 states. Bill Clinton, 1992, comes into office. He raises taxes in 1993, loses 53 seats in the House of Representatives in 1994, By 1996, the economy starts to improve. He wins 49% of the vote in a three-way race, which is just about a landslide because Perot was in the race as well. It looks like the same thing is essentially happening for Joe Biden. The economy will improve. Obviously, inflation is that $64,000 question. Where will inflation be at that point in time? And if the economy is off the table, if it's off the table, and it could not be off the table with all that's going on with the banks, it could be that there's some sort of a disaster we have no idea about. If the economy is off the table, then Joe Biden's biggest liability is obviously his age. And the question, though, is how many voters are actually going to base their vote on that? And my guess is it's a very small number. I think people are looking more on the economy and looking at the macroeconomic, the macroeconomic basis of the economy, and they're looking potentially secondarily and tertiary. They're looking at foreign policy, and if there's any scandal, that's maybe a third or fourth issue. But I don't think the fact, even if people don't like Joe Biden personally, I think they're going to look at they're going to look essentially at their own balance sheets, and they're probably going to say, well, he's better than the other guy. So I think that it's very much going to be advantageous to Joe Biden.
What does Joe Biden do about the Harris problem?
Nothing.
Nothing?
No.
Stay with Harris.
Yeah. She is not much of a liability because she's so much off the stage right now. First of all, the idea that you could actually take an African-American woman and take him and decide that person is going to be off the ticket, that would create an uproar. That would be an unneeded uproar.
Very good point.
Yeah, right. In the Democratic Party, you don't want to do that. It's better to kind of keep her kind of maybe even. It's better to keep her, maybe even not necessarily have her over. She's certainly not overshadowing him. Heck, she'll give a speech at the convention. She'll give a 20, 30-minute speech, and then Joe Biden will give his own speech. But I don't think you hear this all the time. When Nixon dropped Agnew, would Bush drop Quayle? Quayle was very similar predicament because Dan Quayle was very much a liability. But Bush was not going to drop Quayle because if Bush dumps Quayle, what's he saying? He's essentially telling the American people, I made a mistake. There's one example, though, when a president did drop his vice president. Do you know what the last one was?
No.
Ford and Rockefeller.
Oh.
Ford comes into office. Ford nominates Rockefeller. Rockefeller was a liberal former governor of New York. And there is consternation about the Rockefeller choice because of his liberal governance of the state of New York. So in 1976, Ronald Reagan is challenging him for the Republican presidential nomination from the right. And one of his arguments can be that you can talk about the Ford-Rockefeller administration. So Ford basically had to drop Rockefeller and eventually chose Bob Dole, the senator from Kansas, who was seen as a conservative. He later said he regrets that he did that, but that was something that he had to do because Rockefeller did not have that much of a gain, and he needed to win the Republican primary. In this case, I think that Harris is basically going to be a non-entity because for the most part, people do not vote for vice presidents. Vice presidents can be liabilities. If you remember Admiral Stockdale, Ross Perot's running mate, who said, why am I here at the beginning of the debate? That became a liability. But you know what? At the end of the day, Perot outperformed and won 18.9% of the vote.
Okay. So one final question. We're getting up towards an hour. Phil Kate from the beautiful hamlet of Keene, New Hampshire, who listened to this whole thing while he was riding a stationary bike.
Awesome.
Has a question, and Phil may need clarification on this, and I'll give my interpretation, and then Rich can answer. Rather than supplying Ukraine with the tools, why doesn't the U.S. eliminate the supply of weapons Russian soldiers are using? Unless I'm misunderstanding the question, that would require attacking on Russian soil. They would require destroying their airplanes on Russian soil and their ammo dumps and weapons dumps on Russian soil, which would give them an excuse to make things worse.
Yeah, I think that is very much playing with fire. That's why if they did this, that potentially could start another world war. But if the United States, I'll just change it a little bit here. If the United States is really seen as weak, we might get to the point where Grenada might want a rematch.
So, Bakhmut, this is interesting. Bakhmut is holding on, and tactically speaking, I think I would get out of there because I don't know how those people are going to survive.
Right.
They're like 1 kilometer from the enemy.
Yep. And
they're getting surrounded. It does seem though that somebody decided, and they're on board, that we're just going to stay here and sacrifice ourselves to grind the Russian meat and grind the Russian supplies and the Russian tools and just bleed them dry right here, or bleed them drier right here. What do you think on that? Is that why they're holding on to Bakhmut? I know you like talking about this kind of stuff.
I have no idea about this. It's not my pay grade about what the actual strategy is. I don't know. I just know that I don't think the United States would ever try to actually take weapons away from Russian soldiers. That would be the equivalent of Russia deciding they're going to expand the war by going into a NATO country, in which case all the other NATO countries are under obligation under Article 5 of the Charter to go in there, and then we have a third world war.
So the only way you can do it is have these, well, like maybe whether genuine flag or false flag drones picking off stuff, and you could, if you can get the longer range ATACMS missiles, you could get more Russian equipment and soldiers within the Ukrainian border and on Crimea. So that might be what you do to try to do what Phil is suggesting. Is get it's really, anything you can on Ukrainian soil.
Yeah, it's obviously a risk, and it does certainly escalate tensions. But obviously, if you're not actually on Russian soil, you might be circumventing on a technicality there. But I don't think the United States would even quite go to that level. And it's interesting. There is really no appetite in the United States right now on the right or the left. I can't think of any establishment politician or anti-establishment politician who has made the case that we should essentially do anything on Russian soil by actually sending ground troops into Russia, or for that matter, into Ukraine to try to defend Ukraine. I just haven't heard that argument anywhere. This country is so war weary right now. It's amazing when you go back to the 90s. The fact that, for example, when in Haiti in 1994 rather, the United States sent 20,000 ground troops to protect Haiti when they reinstalled President Aristide. I'm trying to imagine a scenario like that today if there was a situation in Haiti or Bosnia or Kosovo, and where the United States actually got involved militarily, how little support there actually would be for that.
It's possible that the United States views this as a good thing because the Russians, due to Putin's fear of a sad legacy, are just going to bleed themselves dry militarily and economically. And so it behooves the United States in some ways, at the expense of the Ukrainians, to string this out as long as possible until, with the idea that maybe Russia will just collapse and won't even be something you need to consider for 15 years.
But then the question is, what's the successor state, and could the successor state be worse than the current state? Who's going to come in and succeed Putin?
I know.
I don't know.
Could be. Hey, thanks very much. It's almost. Do we have one more? So is it to the advantage of the U.S. for the war to go on as long as possible? Right. That's right.
In a steady state, theoretically, from a pure cold-boiled, hard-boiled realpolitik point of view, just have it essentially be a war of attrition, have the status quo, and eventually, Putin's going to die at some point, and then the question is, what will his successor do? And potentially, it's not. They could say, it's not my problem. They could say essentially, we're going to bring the troops home, just like they did after Afghanistan, and essentially almost say, almost not declare a loss. Maybe even say, well, we won. We got everything we want. We got all of our objectives. It's like it's like they used to say about Vietnam. George Aiken, the senator from Vermont, used to say, just declare victory and go home.
Yeah. So that's hopefully what will happen. And maybe the U.S. will have to maybe somebody will have to cede them something so they have a little trophy to take away. Okay. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Will.
Negotiation, yes.
Thanks, everybody. Almost an hour. Didn't plan on this hour, but Rich is such a compelling guest. I always have fun. An hour flies by. Remember when I did talk radio on a radio station? I used to do 5 of these in a row. 5 hours.
You need to get back there.
A lot of times, most of the time, with no guest. Just me running my mouth for 5 hours. Or at least 4 hours. I had one guest tonight. My jaw actually got all sore.
Oh my gosh.
It was a wonderful job, but I got to tell you, being retired is pretty good too. Right, Phil? Okay, that is all. We'll talk to you real soon. Hopefully we'll get back on our Friday track. And If not, we'll try to continue to do once a week. Share this, everybody. We need all the
Yes.
followers we can get. That's
Absolutely.
pretty much an hour exactly. So we'll talk to you soon. Rich Rubino. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're getting right up on an hour, and thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.
Okay, bye.